Good morning and welcome to Moments with Melinda. I am your host, Melinda Moulton. And today, my guest is Steph Yu. Hi, Steph. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to be on my show. Let me tell my viewers a little bit about you. Steph is the executive director and president of the Public Asset Institute, where she focuses on advancing economic security for all Vermonters. That's a big job.
It is.
It is. And how long have you been in this position?
So I've only been the executive director since the beginning of 2023, but I've been with public assets for 9 years now.
Right, right. That's true. I read that about you. Um, so let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and about your early childhood, Steph.
Wow. Okay. So I've been in New England for a long time, although with stints other places. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, Westminster. There's another Westminster in Vermont too, I think. But, small town, 5,000 people, far from Boston, far from sort of any of the East Coast traffic. So similar in a lot of ways to lots of parts of Vermont, but really didn't know much about Vermont. Really hadn't been here before we moved here.
So what brought you? What brought you to Vermont?
Well, so let me just say that we didn't, I didn't really have roots in Massachusetts. We moved there when I was a baby. My father is an immigrant, a Chinese immigrant who grew up in the Philippines, and my mother's a Midwesterner. So no real ties to New England, but for me, it's home. Um, and the So we had moved around a lot since then. I grew up here and then my parents left Massachusetts when I was in college, and then I've sort of lived all over the place in a number of states, California, New York, Michigan, West Virginia. And abroad, and then found ourselves back here, back in New England, and happy to be back. Definitely missed the snow and the fall and all those things.
So what brought you back to New England? What was the impetus that brought you back here?
I think it does. I think New England is home. My husband's grew up in Maine as well, and so I think there were some ties here. Although most of our family isn't here anymore, but we do still have some family ties here. And I think our kids were little when we moved back here. The oldest had just finished kindergarten, and the younger one was 3, I think. So we like the idea of raising our kids in New England and coming back to like I say, the seasons and the schools and sort of some of the things that I think really draw people to Vermont.
And it's Vermont. It's not just New England. You came back to Vermont.
Yeah, so part of it was it's always a challenge for both partners to find jobs in a new place. Especially my husband's a professor, so there's always limited options for academics in any given year. But we knew we wanted to be back in the Northeast, and we were pretty open, but we were very excited about Vermont. I think partly because um, we don't miss the traffic in I don't miss the traffic in Boston. I don't miss those pieces. And we love cross country skiing. We love the outdoor piece. So that was definitely a big pull.
Or the drivers in Boston. They can be a little rude.
Can be a little much, yeah.
So thank you for sharing that because I always like my viewers to start at the beginning and share a little bit about their upbringing. Um, so who would you say had the greatest impact on your life and helping you find your place in the work that you're doing today?
I think it's a lot. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I mean, probably my parents, most of all, sort of single biggest influence, I think, in a lot of lives. But I do think that experience of being, where I grew up in Massachusetts was small rural town. There were no other families of color. My Chinese father was the only person in town that, the only immigrant in town probably. And and so I think that really shaped this sort of sense of kind of both the sense of sort of a bigger world and also the sense of recognizing what it's like to sort of be outside of a lot of that, of a lot of sort of the mainstream culture or community of a place. So I think that was a big part of it, but I think it was also just, really, really raising us with the idea that we should be contributing, that we should be doing something to help people. And I think that got reinforced throughout my years in various places. I think our time during our time in West Virginia, I was running the state's AmeriCorps programs. And that's a very, it's a very different culture. There's a lot of regional differences, but it's also parts of the world that have really been left behind for a long time. And so I think that also sort of reinforced the systemic nature of a lot of these challenges, as well as the the reasons why different communities get deliberately excluded or left behind. So I think all of that sort of contributed to getting here.
Fascinating. So is that what inspired you to get into serving and supporting the social network for more marginalized communities? I mean, what was the impetus for you to decide to serve these communities?
I mean, I think that yes, I think that's largely right. I think, recognizing sort of the challenges that people of color have faced in this country for a long time, particularly Black Americans, but also immigrants, and sort of looking at the ways in which, we're seeing that now, kind of the waves of anti-immigrant sentiment that have sort of permeated, as long as I've been alive, and certainly before that, right? So I think that was part of it. I think that, like I say, I think having worked in the corporate side of things, and having worked for a couple of different state governments, and seeing some of the same sort of systemic patterns repeated in different places and under different circumstances, and really starting to think about how our communities function, how our society functions in terms of what, who's making money off of what, and how is power being consolidated, and really kind of thinking about those things. I think it sort of leads you to the conclusion that um, government should be a force for good, hasn't always been, and yet it's the best tool we have to have the communities that we want. So really focusing on policy as the way to create the communities we want.
Now you are a member of the Vermont Professionals of Color Network. Can you talk to us about this group?
Yes, and actually, I just joined the board as of October. It's a great group. I've been so excited I've sort of been watching from the beginning as this group has gotten off the ground, and it's an amazing group, and I think has the right idea. This was part of what I was thinking about growing up as you're sort of activating the childhood memories. I think growing up in Massachusetts and feeling really isolated as a kid of color, and feeling really isolated, at that time and place. And I think that happens for a lot of people of color in Vermont. There's a relatively small population. We're still one of the least diverse states. And I think it can be very isolating. There's a bit of a community in Chittenden County, but certainly in other parts of the state, I think there's both a sense of isolation and a real sense of hypervisibility, right? That you stand out in a lot of ways. And so I think what professionals of color the TPOC is trying to do is really some great stuff. There's a couple of different layers. One, it's about connection and building communities. Two, that professional piece is a broad definition, right? It's an inclusive definition of what we mean by professional. Anybody working. And so really thinking about that, and recognizing that a lot of us have never had mentors of color, right? Leadership positions are so often filled with white men, sometimes white women, but what does that look like to really mentor the next generation and develop leaderships? And so another part of the professionals of color work is looking at mentoring high school students, and making sure that people understand that there's a path, and that there's other people out there that they can talk to, and that there are people in every sector in Vermont that can give them support, can give them guidance, can just listen, all of the above. So I think we're really trying to do some great work, and I give so much credit to Wei Wei and Tino, the co-executive directors, who have just taken this from a nothing to a pretty great something.
Well, how do my viewers get involved? What's the website? How do they get involved?
So it's vtpoc.org and
VP.
POC, so Vermont Professionals of Color. Um, and members are welcome, and membership can look like a whole lot of things. It can be just participating in some of the community events. There's a lot of just get-togethers just for, communal space. There's some communal working events. There's also a lot of trainings that people can sign up for. So webinars on a whole bunch of things. If you're working in a nonprofit world, how can we be helpful? If you're trying to get a federal grant, what does it look like? What's available to the state? So whole range of ways to get
Yes.
involved in as much as or as little as you might want, I think.
So to my viewers, if you're interested, please go to the Vermont Professionals of Color Network website and get involved if you're so inclined. Now, let's move on to your present work. You are the executive director of the Public Assets Institute. So can you talk to us about this organization and what your mission and goals are?
So our mission is to improve the economic well-being of all Vermonters, and by that we mean all people in the state, whether they think of themselves as Vermonters or not, or whether they're what you think of when you hear that word or not. And and we do that, and that's about racial equity, it's about social equity, it's about economic equity, all of those fights. And we've really been thinking a lot about economic security and thinking about what it means to have economic security across your lifetime and in any circumstances. So I think we saw in the pandemic some of this at work, more money going into people's pockets, more housing dollars, plenty of food dollars going in, and what it can look like when we're actually committed to making sure that everybody has enough. So that's the work of it. What we do in practice is a lot of crunching numbers, Excel spreadsheets, trying to make charts pretty and interesting to people, which is really, which is definitely kind of braids my interest because I do appreciate good data visualization and really kind of trying to chase down what's true about what's happening. Um, so that's our work. And,
Well,
there's so much more that more to do than we can possibly do, but we're
But
trying.
we're gonna dig a little deeper into all of this. So I so appreciate the work that you do. It's extraordinary to do this research on you and this organization. So Steph, as a result of the current election and the harsh outcomes marginalized Americans will be experiencing under a Trump administration, how will your work protect them?
So this has been a big part of what we've been thinking about. A lot of our work, and I will give Vermont policymakers some credit. I think that there has been a real effort, particularly during the pandemic work and over the last couple of years, by both the administration and the legislature to be inclusive in policies, right? A lot of the federal pandemic aid only went to citizens. There was a real effort in Vermont to expand some of that, to put up state dollars, to expand those programs to people without documentation. And I think that that has been really positive. At the same time, we also recognize that we're a border state and that the present, there is a presence here of border security and can make life difficult for folks. So I think I give credit in the sense that I think that it's not just us who are concerned about protecting people, regardless of immigration status. But I think that is a big part of where the concern is. I spent last week actually in DC. So we also have counterpart organizations in most other states, and I think we're in 42 states now, who do similar work at the state policy level to us. And then we have a federal partner who does this, a national partner who does this work at the federal level and helps to kind of bring us together and just make sure we're connected when there's other states that are sort of facing the same problem and that kind of thing. But part of that conversation was really about what is it going to look like when communities are really under threat? Immigrant communities, LGBTQ communities, there's a lot. I think those are sort of immediate concerns, but certainly BIPOC folks writ large have a lot of concerns, understandable concerns about what it's going to look like. I mean, we saw what happened under the first administration, which, was maybe less prepared for the work. So I think the first is to keep talking about the ways in which we need to help protect Vermonters without documentation and really recognize that they're a critical part of our communities, that they're paying taxes, that they're part of our workforce, that they're a part of Vermont. And I think that like I say, I think the good news is that there's a lot of support for that. And I think it continues to be to sort of fight for the resources for everyone. I also think there's a democratic element to this, to our work, a promotion of democracy and democratic values to our work that maybe is not as obvious as some of our other work, but I think is really critical. So, Vermont likes to pride itself on town meeting day. We have community involvement, and yet I think there's still a lot of ways where we could be more engaged, be having better conversations, and be really seeing government as a tool of the people to get the state that we want. And I think some of our work is in the boring stuff of the process of that. What does that look like to be weighing in on the actual state budget and to have more community involvement in that? And I think it's also sort of some of it's the real policy work too, but it's also some of the conceptual and cultural work of, what does it look like to participate and what does it look like to listen to each other and to spend the time and have the relationships. And frankly, I think it should be a state, part of state government is that public engagement infrastructure should be there. There's been pushes in the past, but it could be better, right?
It could be better. Well, I'm going to move on here to the work of the Public Assets Institute because it includes listening to Vermonters on how our state can work better for them. So how do my viewers reach out to you with their voices to share their thoughts? How can my viewers engage in the Public Assets Institute?
Well, we always love to hear from people. Believe it or not, we're not bombarded with messages from people, so we do appreciate the ones that we get. A lot of people do react to our work and send us emails or comments or, engage in social media in that way. But we also appreciate the sort of more in-depth conversations. I will say I've been doing a couple of, we try to do outreach tours pretty regularly and participate in community events of our partners and do that across the state. One thing that I've been doing recently actually is um, Bess O'Brien has this film, Just Getting By, and she's been on tour with this. It's about housing and food insecurity in Vermont. And I've been going with her to a number of screenings to have these conversations about what we do at the policy level to address some of what you're seeing on screen, which has been great and has brought us to a lot of places and people who aren't necessarily following our work or very engaged in state policy, but who appreciate the storytelling that Bess is able to do. So that's one piece. Similarly, we've gotten involved with the Vermont Reads program this year because the book is so pertinent. The Gather, which is a great story and, just beautifully written, but also, accessible, a young adult book, accessible to anybody, but really paints the picture of ways in which our systems are failing kids and families. And so we've been participating, we're on the docket to participate in a number of community conversations around that. And we just, we go wherever. I've been to school boards, I've been to PTOs, I've been to any of these things. So if there are community events that we can be useful or just you'd like us to hear the conversation, please reach out.
Thank you so much. So to my viewers, the Public Assets Institute website is www.publicassets.org. And it is filled with really interesting and important information. And there is a video on your website, which is deeply informative, by the way. It's called Property Tax Relief for Vermonters, your three-part plan. And can you just share a bit of the thinking behind this plan? Because so many are struggling to handle this 14% increase in their property taxes, Steph.
Yeah. So I think two things can be true, which is that Vermonters can want good public schools and quality education for their kids and not be able to cope with higher property taxes, and so one of the things that we've identified as we've been doing a lot of this work, so Vermont has a unique education funding system. It's a statewide system. It's different than most other states where things are raised at the local level and it's really more of a local. And so you see in other states, you see really a lot of disparity between wealthy towns and less wealthy ones. And in Vermont, we have income sensitivity, which allows more people to pay based on income. Most Vermont homeowners pay some or all of their bill based on income and not based on the property rate. But what's been happening is that we haven't changed those thresholds for income sensitivity in a long time. And so more and more Vermonters are being put in this position of having to pay both an income-based piece and a property-based piece. And as property values keep going up, that property piece gets bigger and bigger and really is pretty out of whack. And what that means, and ultimately, middle-class Vermonters are paying the largest share, larger than high-income Vermonters. And income sensitivity helps for low-income Vermonters. I think it does make school taxes more manageable. But again, it's gotten out of whack. So our plan is really to update those thresholds so that income sensitivity does what it was intended to do, which is make sure that people can afford to pay their school taxes.
Thank you. That's really important. So I also loved your website. Again, it's publicassets.org. I really encourage my viewers to visit your website. It hosts a lot of fabulous charts and graphs, which I'm a very visual learner. And I love graphs and I love numbers. And it really, gets down to the meat of the issue by using that kind of analytical tool. but it helps to explain the state of our economic realities here in Vermont. And one is the state and local taxes as a share of family income. And you state that Vermont is one of the few states where the tax system does not make inequality worse. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So in most states, so states have a variety of tax systems. Vermont has what we like to call the three-legged stool of consumption taxes, property taxes, and income taxes. And those are sort of the big three taxes that most states use some combination of, and the federal government, right? Well, the federal government doesn't really have property taxes. But the point is that we try to have this mix of taxes. And in a lot of states, the income tax is progressive, meaning that you pay a larger share the higher your income. But sales tax tend to be regressive, meaning that lower income people are going to pay a bigger share because you have to buy a certain amount of stuff and it takes a bigger bite out of a smaller budget. So sales taxes tend to be really regressive. So states that rely more on sales taxes and less on income taxes tend to have regressive systems, meaning that they are exacerbating income inequality. They're making the gap bigger between the lower income and the higher income because they're asking lower income to pay a larger share in taxes. Property taxes also tend to be regressive, partly because you can only buy such, there are only the houses that are available only get so expensive relative to your income. You can have sort of unlimited income, but there's sort of a limit to how much you're going to spend on your property. Um, so but in Vermont, because of income sensitivity, our school taxes are this mix of income-based and property taxes. So our property taxes are less regressive, particularly at the low income end, although they're still regressive at the high end. So the combination results in a system that's mostly progressive, but just a little regressive at the top. And which is better than a lot of states. There are some states, like I say, who don't have income taxes, who rely wholly on sales taxes or property taxes, and really hit lower income folks in the states harder.
Isn't that like Florida? That's why a lot of Vermonters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a surprise. So Florida relies a lot on property taxes, right? And doesn't have an income tax, as we keep hearing about. And yet, I'll point out, as we always have to in these conversations, is that just as many people come to Vermont from Florida as go to Florida from Vermont. It's just that we don't know them. So we'll have an updated report on some of the state to state migration in January.
Oh, great. Well, make sure you share that with me. So you have some great campaigns that your organization is doing, and like the anti-poverty tax credits for a strong Vermont, Fair Share for Vermont, which can be seen on your website, publicassets.com/campaign. Talk to us about a couple of these initiatives that you're working on.
So the Fair Share for Vermont campaign is a coalition-based. They're all coalition-based work. We work with partners on pretty much every issue, and that's a sort of a critical value, I think, that we're not going it alone on this stuff. But the Fair Share for Vermont campaign has been working for a couple of years now to, again, correct that regressivity in our tax code. So we do have this regressivity at the top to correct that, to make our system wholly progressive. And what that looks like is raising the income tax on higher income Vermonters. Because that's a progressive piece of our tax code, that's where we want to go. And when we say high income, we mean people making more than $500,000 a year. So under 2% of Vermont taxpayers we're talking about, but that's the correction there. And there's some great work. There's a lot of great partners involved in that work.
And Steph, there are a lot of Vermonters who are willing to pay that.
There's a lot of, well, not only that, but there's also just broad support across the board, right? And we've had wealthy Vermonters sign on because they believe that we should have a progressive system.
You're here.
Yep. And then the anti-poverty tax credit work is also, as I was referring to this expanding of some of our tax credits to folks without documentation. But Vermont has a state child tax credit as of 2022, which is great. I think it was partly to kind of fill the hole left, the feds expanded their child tax credit during the pandemic and then dialed it back down, and Vermont wanted to step up a bit. So we have a good child tax credit. It only applies to kids under 6. We'd like to expand that to all kids. And then we also, the earned income tax credit, Vermont has a fairly robust state earned income tax credit, but especially for single folks, people without dependents, it's pretty small and it doesn't make a huge difference. And what we're finding, we're actually in the middle of working on our year-end State of Working Vermont report, and what we're finding is that single people, whether they have kids or not, are really struggling to make ends meet. A lot of that is the cost of housing, a lot of other factors. But bottom line is that we really want to beef up that piece for the earned income tax credit for folks without dependents, because it really is not, it could be making a much bigger difference than it is.
Right, and it'll help bring young people to the state too,
Mhm, mhm,
right?
mhm.
Um, so Steph, what would your advice be for those who are fearful for our future, for the future of our country and the future of our planet? What would your advice be, especially
Um,
to young people?
yeah, I mean, I think the advice is keep going, right? I mean, now's the time. I think more than ever, state policy matters, I'll say, more than ever right now. I think we can do things as a state that we can't, that might be harder at the national level. I also, Vermont likes to think of itself as exceptional sometimes in some ways, but I do think being a small state has advantages and disadvantages. But one of the advantages is that, we do have community ties. We can have these conversations, I think, in ways, and we can take matters into our own hands in ways that would be harder in a bigger state, I think. So I think the bottom line is keep going. I think for us, we believe in this work. We believe, we believe that this work is important, and you know, everybody should have economic security, and we have the resources to make it happen in Vermont. So I think the answer is keep going. It doesn't help if you look away. It doesn't help if you give up. That's what I keep telling myself
But
anyway,
keep
because
going.
there's
So
definitely
keep
been some bad moments.
one step in front of the other. Again, to my viewers, Steph Yu is the executive director and president of Public Assets Institute. Their website is publicassets.org. I encourage you to go to that website and get involved. Steph is there to listen to you and wants to hear what you have to say about the state of Vermont's economy, and how we can do better. So, Steph, your leadership of the Public Asset Institute is really a valuable gift for the state. Your core functions, from what I understand from your website, are watchdog, myth busting, power building, and research and development. And the goal of your organization is to create a state where everyone can thrive. To my viewers, there's also a donate button on the website. And I'm assuming that it's important to support your work from private donations. So I encourage our viewers to go to that donate button and support this work because it really does help all of us. So thank you, Steph, so much for being on my show. And I'd
Thank you
love to
for having
interview
me.
you again when some of these studies come out so we can dive deep into them and learn more from the work that you're doing and the group that you're doing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds great.
All right. And to my viewers, I wish you a beautiful day and a beautiful holiday, and I'll see you shortly. Bye-bye.